Step closer, step closer. That board is a little bit rickety. Here at the end of the dock, it's sometimes unsteady. And so many people don't visit out here. Would you believe they're afraid to fall into the water? Intimidated by the tales of vengeful creatures who would pull humans down to their doom. Silly stories, don't you think? Oh, but those silly stories are what you're here for, isn't it? You want to hear the mermaid's tale. Oh, you want to see the mermaid's tale? Well, you'll have to hear the tale of the mermaid's tale, and the tale of the mermaid, whose tale the tale comes from, before you can see the mermaid tale. I know you're excited, but the coin is just a part of the payment. You have to hear the story in order to see the tale. Come sit. Oh, no, not so close. No, not within touching distance. I have the tale right here, right under this blanket. You'll see it soon enough. But you wouldn't want to touch it. It's dangerous to chase after such things without knowing about them. You would understand that if you listened to the mermaid's tale. Yes, yes. Then you may see the tale. First, pay the boy. Thank you. Now, we've all heard the tales of the mermaids, and especially the sirens with their songs that can lure sailors to their doom. But not all mermaids are sirens, though all have a compelling voice. That is, when they're in their fit and proper state. But what you might not know is that while humans tell each other stories of mermaids and share cautionary tales like the one I'm about to tell you, the mermaids have their own stories about humans. Young mermaids are warned about the evil creatures of the surface who will seduce them and steal them away for Kraken only knows what purpose. But just as sailors look out to the sea with longing, wondering what's hidden within the depths, so too are mermaids fascinated with the surface, and on occasion, they stare out above the waves and dream. And just as the humans like to sit and stare out into the ocean from a ship or a dock and listen to the sounds of the dolphins chittering and the sea lions barking, the merfolk also listen from beneath their hulls and under the docks. They listen to you when you're near the water, and they hear your stories of love and triumph and wickedness and betrayal, and so they know that humans are inconstant creatures whose moods and loyalties change like the tides. So it was that this young mermaid in question, the mermaid whose tale you came to see, this young mermaid was listening in on the stories the sailors told each other in the hull and on the deck of their anchored ship. Everywhere she swam around the ship, she heard a different story, and every time she circled the ship and came back to one point or another, another story had begun. She spent hours listening to their tales. She was listening intently to the raucous laughter within and laughing quietly at their jokes, when she suddenly realized that she was being watched. She'd had no idea for how long. But there, leaning over the railing of the ship, was the captain. A handsome man. He was called Jack the Lad, though he was years past being a lad. Captain Jack just leaned down the rail, watching her. He made no move at all to call anyone over, nor did he seem at all interested in trying to capture her. He only seemed curious about her, Of course, her initial reaction was to duck underwater and dash away quickly. When she again appeared above the surface, far, far away, she saw him, just as he had been, in the same spot, in the same posture. From that distance, she couldn't tell if he could see her, but she had the sense that he did, until he turned his back and put his elbows on the railing. She drifted closer, curious about the handsome man. For a moment he disappeared, as he bent down and was hidden from her perspective, but then he stood again, and she saw his broad back, still toward her. Something small and round jumped in the air above his head and dropped back down into his hand. He tossed it up again and caught it. She drifted closer, curious about him and about what he had, and intrigued by the way it caught the light of the moon. Up, shimmer, down. Up, shimmer, down. Up, shimmer, down. She drifted closer still. Suddenly the captain tossed the sphere over his head and into the water, where it bobbed on the surface. It was a glass float used by the fishermen to keep up their nets. She giggled, realizing he'd known she was there all along. She swam to the ship to return his float, but she wasn't entirely silly. She kept a wide distance from him, and then, with her strong tail, she launched herself above the surface and set the float on the railing, yards out of his reach, and ducked back into the water. He didn't look at her when she returned to the float. He didn't seem to have even noticed, but when she was a distance away again, he took a single step to the side and reached with his long arm to collect the float. And when he stood straight up again, he popped it over his shoulder once more. Once more she retrieved it. If she had known that this was how humans play with their pets, she might not have been so charmed. But she didn't. So she was. The next time she brought it to him, she held it just within his reach, but no closer. He glanced back over his shoulder and smiled a smile that lit her night, and turned to reach down the side of the ship to take it from her. His fingertips brushed hers, but he made no move to grab her, earning her trust inch by inch. He turned his back once more, and when he did, curiosity got the better of her. She rose out of the water just high enough to pet him. She just rose up and stroked his back as if he were a creature in a petting zoo. Then she dashed back into the water a safe distance and watched him from there, giggling. He turned to face her and leaned over the railing to talk to her. "You're a bold one, aren't you?" he said, "not like any of the mer I've heard of." She only giggled in response, and he asked what made her different from all the others. She only shrugged a bare shoulder, her breast bobbing above the water, and widened that smile. She returned to the side of the ship and reached her hand up high, gesturing for him to come within reach so that she could pet him again. He did, bending his head so that she could feel his hair. And in turn, he reached out to stroke her head. They must have made quite the scene, those two. "You're certainly not afraid," he told her, as she explored the textures of his face, his smooth nose, his grainy chin. "I can't say anyone's ever touched me like this," he told her, and yet it sent shivers through him. She even stroked her fingers across his full lips and pressed them into his mouth to feel his teeth. He gently bit her and made her laugh. She rose up out of the water quickly at that and gave him a peck on the cheek before falling back into the water with a delighted laugh. After that, he leaned over the rail, chatting with her as she listened. Occasionally, he asked a question that she found ways to answer without using her lovely voice. "What do you do for enjoyment?" he asked, and she responded by swimming far away and demonstrating how high she could propel herself out of the water and flip in the air before slicing back under the surface. "Do you have siblings?" She nodded. "Does she have a favorite?" She'd nod again. Little by little, they got to know each other this way. She even launched herself out of the water to sit on the railing beside him, her beautiful tail draping down the side of the ship as they talked through the night. The wind whipped that night and made her shiver, but he brought her a blanket to wrap around her. The wool was itchy but warm, and while she had to scratch a few times, it was a small price to pay. That itchy wool blanket is probably why she didn't notice her scales getting dry and flaky. She just absent-mindedly scratched as she shed scale after scale. And to make matters worse, when she was delighted, she would swing her tail and bounce it against the side of the ship, sending more scales fluttering down to the water. It wasn't until her darling Jack reached down to gently swipe some flaking scales that she looked down to see how dull and dead her tail appeared, emerging from under the blanket. She began to panic. She looked down with horror in her heart as she unwrapped the blanket from around herself and saw her precious, beautiful tail just desiccating. A line had formed down the center of it, a depression, like a crack that forms in the earth during an earthquake. Her precious Captain Jack was every bit as upset as she was, and he rushed to scoop her up into his arms and pulled her onto the deck of the ship. But as he did, her tail scraped along the railing. Her beautiful fin scraped and broke, leaving only the root behind, looking like two appendages, two human feet, emerging at the bottom of a sheath of a mermaid's tattered tail. Now, you've all seen the statues and the poses of the mermaids sitting on rocks, with their fins bent where human knees would be, off to the side, sitting as a human would sit on their hip. And there's truth to that. It is the way that most mer will position themselves when sitting on land. But this mer, with her desiccated tail so damaged already, when she bent her tail where hips and knee would be, it split right down the center, and she was left with legs. It happens like that, that mer who dry out will look human, but having legs doesn't mean that you have legs that you can use. She was left there on the deck of the ship, broken and lost and trapped above the surface. She tried desperately to scurry back to the water to get to the railing, pulling herself by her arms. But Jack was holding on to her. He told her it was no use. He told her that her legs couldn't help her in the sea, especially when she was so unaccustomed to using them. That if she dove back into the water, she would drown. And the very idea of a mermaid drowning, of her entire world being deadly to her, left her ruined and heartbroken on the deck of that ship, crying into her captain's arms. He stroked her head and petted her and comforted her, and his comfort turned to caresses, and his caresses turned to kisses, and she accepted it. It encouraged it even, this momentary escape from her anguish. And it was wonderful. While she was lost to the ocean, he created new waves within her, and she rode that tide until it brought her crashing on a shore of ecstasy that might have been enough to make up for some small measure of what she'd lost when she came out of the sea. His crew all knew what was happening. They made themselves scarce while the captain and his mermaid were on deck. And when it was done, she fell asleep in his arms, still on deck, looking up at the stars that looked the same as they had when she was in the water. And it seemed so strange to her that everything had changed, but those stars remained constant. In the morning, the captain went back to his duties, commanding his ship, taking charge of his crew. He was very masterful and skilled, very impressive. On occasion, he would look over to his mermaid where she sat, now wrapped only in that blanket. His cabin boy brought her a shirt to put on that hung down low enough to cover her for modesty's sake, a modesty she was not accustomed to, but seemed to be a requirement on that ship among those human men. And the cabin boy brought her food, a bowl of fish stew. And he taught her that she wasn't to stick her face into it and chase after the fish that was in there, that she could hold it with her hands and raise it to her mouth and make much less mess. The cabin boy made a little nest for her with some extra blankets so that she could sit comfortably on the deck while she watched her beloved captain across the ship as he commanded his crew. His men made jokes that she didn't quite understand. The mer don't have the same sense of modesty, you see, and their coupling comes with no sense of shame for expressing their affection and enjoying each other's bodies. But her beloved captain seemed to enjoy the attention, the admiration of his men for having captured the mermaid's heart, they said. It gave her pause when one of them mentioned having captured her body. Something about those comments didn't sit easy with her. It didn't seem as though they were just talking about her coupling with the captain. But a feeling and a sense isn't much to go on. And so she was easily distracted soon enough, watching the men walk back and forth on their legs like she now had. She watched keenly as their legs went up and forward, one after the other, Sitting in her little nest made of blankets, her legs began to twitch as she tried to mimic and imagine how she might be able to move around on legs. The captain saw her watching everyone's legs, and he made a comment that she was too naive to understand completely. When he said, "You seem fascinated by her legs. Would you like me to show you more?" Oh, she was all intent and quick interest. He dropped his pants, and his crew laughed riotously at a joke she didn't understand. She began to feel like even more of an outsider, even more alien to them than she had to begin with. And she felt so very desperately lonely for the home that was the sea just feet beneath her. The cabin boy understood what she wanted. He asked if she wanted help learning to walk, and he helped her stand. He lifted her up with his chest to her back, his arms around her waist, and let her move her legs in what seemed to her a walking motion. He held her up, and the two giggled and laughed as she began to make progress, but still wobbled every time he let go of her just a little bit. That caught the captain's attention again. He came over and yanked the mermaid away from the cabin boy, as if she were an object that he owned. And he hit the cabin boy so hard he sent the young man sprawling to the deck as he lifted the mermaid and carried her off to his cabin. What he did there, I won't mention in detail, but it shocked her. The captain explained to her that she was his property. He told her exactly how much he could get for her, how much he could get for her alive, and how much he could get for her in pieces. And she understood then that he had never loved her, and she had been a fool. She wept bitterly to have been betrayed by the captain she loved. And for the first time, she used her voice, and she wailed. Her face was a mask of confusion and hurt, but her voice was shock and fear and pain and betrayal, and it carried across the sea, alarming the crew and drawing the attention of every sea creature within leagues. And as she cried out her betrayal, around the ship, a number of human-looking heads emerged from the water, as the merfolk responded to the anguish of one of their own. It was only then that the captain realized what he had done. With a feral snarl, he jerked himself away from her and ran to the window to see the ship surrounded by merfolk, as his betrayed lover curled on the bed, sobbing. And in the distance, a siren began to sing. The captain's heart pounded in his chest as he stared out to the sea and saw writhing tentacles and glowing eyes. He knew that this was no ordinary encounter. These creatures were vengeful spirits of the deep, drawn to her pain and suffering. She wept bitter tears to have been betrayed by the captain she loved. And outside the cabin, the crew heard the siren and were compelled. The ship pitched as it took a sudden turn toward the rocks. It was the captain's turn to scream, and with a blood-curdling cry, he grabbed his sword and charged out of his cabin to protect himself and his crew from those otherworldly beings. He swung wildly at anything that moved, not caring if it was tentacle or mer. The first mate was at the helm, steering the ship toward its doom. Only the captain seemed unaffected by the siren's song, and only because the wails of the woman he'd betrayed drowned them out. And the cabin boy, who, once he had recovered from being laid down by the captain, had come to the cabin to protect the mermaid with his young life, if need be. The captain fought with all of his might, his muscles straining against the supernatural forces at work. Sweat dripped down his face as he dodged and parried, trying desperately to keep the ship from being torn apart by these vengeful creatures. But the ship pitched one last time, and its hull crashed onto one of the towering needle rocks that jutted out half a mile from shore. The ship began to fill with seawater that poured into the room where the poor, dry mermaid was trapped with her useless legs. As he fought, Captain Jack could hear the desperate cries of his crews, the voices becoming fainter and farther away as the ship plummeted down to its doom. The young cabin boy got into the cabin's quarters and pulled the mermaid away, his slim body struggling to fight the rush of water and carry the struggling girl who had no faith in humans at this point, even if they had once seemed so kind. Jack's vision began to blur as he gasped for air, his lungs burning with salt water that flooded his chest, but he refused to give up. He'd failed the crew, and he could only imagine one way to rectify the situation. The mermaid was also being pulled under, her human lungs unable to draw oxygen from her briny surroundings. Seeing the mermaid being pulled away, Jack found new strength within him. He fought harder than ever before, trying desperately to reach the surface. His muscles screamed in agony as he struggled against the crushing pressure of the ocean depths. The mermaid tried to breathe water, as was natural for her, and her lungs filled with the deadly sea. With one final burst of energy, Jack broke free from the watery prison that threatened to claim his life, and he reached out for the mermaid, his fingers just barely grazing her hand before he was pulled under as well. But he thought it wasn't over yet. If he could save the mermaid, he might save himself or what's left of his crew. The mermaid lost consciousness. Her last thought was at the irony of her drowning, and then her world went dark. The moment Jack's lips touched the surface, he sucked in a desperate breath of air, coughing and gasping, reaching down into the depths once more to grab hold of the mermaid. But she sank away from his grasp, pulled into the sea from whence she came. He would never see her again. Jack came out of the water alive, telling the story of how he watched her disappear into the depths. He said that he knew he couldn't save them all, but this loss cut deep. As if he'd actually cared. The sun shone on a distant beach where the mermaid lay after her adventure. No one was there to see her looking like the half-morphed creature she was, except for the cabin boy who had pulled her body from the water. So far as the boy knew, the rest of the crew was dead. He pulled a blanket out of the water and draped it over the mermaid's body and sighed. She'd looked so young and she'd been so sweet. He silently cursed Jack and brushed the mermaid's damp hair from her face. He cared for her, kept her damp over the course of the next weeks, as slowly but surely she recovered. He fished for her, and he fed her, and he kept her safe, until finally she could go back to the sea, and the sea from where she had first jumped out of the water. But she was alive. And she had a human she loved, who was worthy of her love, in the cabin boy. Oh no, not like that. No. He's like a brother to her, if her brother had legs. Which, to be fair, her brother being a mer, he could have legs, if he were willing to pay the same price that she did. Oh, yes. I did say that you could see the mermaid's tail. Here you are. Behold. What? You expected it to be desiccated and dried, pulled from the ocean? How silly do you think the mer are? I'm not foolish enough to let it get dried out twice. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm feeling a little parched. And it's time for a swim. Hey, cupcakes. I know that was a long one. I hope you liked that long one. I hope you liked it being that long. I had that idea mapped out in my head, and I found myself last week with no voice and plenty of time to write things out that I normally would have to split time between writing and acting. So I hope you liked it. I was pleased with that story. And it is, for those of you who have imagined and guessed, it is a part of the bigger story for the Pirate Queen story. That will be back. That character will be back soon. In the meantime, though, I've kept you guys long enough. I would like to say a quick hello and welcome to Caleb Fine and Mr. Matt 85, who are now patrons. Thank you very much for your support. And also a very special thank you to all of my Bakers and Pound Cake tier patrons, there is Mr. Fabulous, Tiny the Taxman, the FPS Player, Meryl, Inline Flaws, Mr. Rickles, Anin, Nick, Always Able, Lion in Winter, Infinite Moon, Old Bean UK, Kulu Bear, Forces, The Swaggy Llama, Artlow, Pierce Tailish, Bellamy, Tomberry Shuffle, and Christian Cleopatra. You guys are my rocks, so thank you so much. And also, I have started getting back to responding to my comments that I missed for so long while I was away, and you guys are so very wonderful and so very charming, and thank you very much for all your comments and your kindness. So, you know what I want from you. I want you to be as good to yourselves as you are to me, and I will speak to you tomorrow with a shorter recording tomorrow. Take care. Talk to you later.